Hi. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be having a wonderful, engaging, colorful, informative conversation with Naima Keith, who is the Chief Curator and Deputy Director at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, and Diana Nawi, who is an independent curator based in Los Angeles as well. They are both the newly appointed curators of Prospect New Orleans, Prospect 5 New Orleans, which will be taking place in 2020. So with that introduction, can you guys give us a little bit of background about both yourselves, and then we'll transition into kind of what you're working on with Prospect?
Thank you. And I just want to say, you may notice that Ayesha is not Gia Hamilton. Gia, because we moved the talk times around, Gia's actually stuck in traffic, as many of us have been throughout the week. And so because we had to push things back and all that kind of stuff, Ayesha has graciously agreed to chat with us this afternoon. So thank God she knows us well enough to just kind of jump into the situation. So we're just going to kind of free flow it. That being said, I am originally from Los Angeles, California. I went to Spelman undergrad and to UCLA for graduate school. And then I worked at the Hammer Museum and then the Student Museum in Harlem. And now I'm at the California African American Museum. While I've been to New Orleans several times in the context of visiting, and one of my best friends with the Tulane and that kind of thing, this is actually my first time working professionally in the city. And this is also actually our first time organizing a triennial of this size. But I think, in terms of being committed to working with artists throughout, the country and working on group exhibitions, as well as thinking about geography and I think history in a very concrete way, I think we've both been doing for quite some time. Prospect began after Hurricane Katrina. It was started by Dan Cameron, who was a curator at that time based in Los Angeles, but had recently been spending a lot of time in New Orleans. And the idea around Prospect was to really think of a way to, I don't say reinvigorate, but just kind of call attention to or bring attention to the importance of the arts community in the city after Katrina. And so it's been going on since 2008. And so Dan was the very first director of Prospect. And then he also did the second Prospect. Franklin Sermons organized, who's now the director of the Perez Art Museum, did the Prospect 3. Trevor Schumacher, who's now at the Nasher, did Prospect 4. And as you'll notice, they have not had any ladies, so we are the first women artistic directors of Prospect. So we're not only the first team, but we're also the first two ladies to organize Prospect. And so, but they always kind of ask outside curators to come in to organize Prospect. And so we're really excited about the opportunity.
I'm Diana, and I went to undergrad at UCLA, and that's actually how I know Naima. We go way back. We were both interns at an art space there. Naima helped me draft my cover letters to graduate school, so we have really been in the trenches together for a very long time. And I have lived all over the country in New York and Chicago, and was here for 5 years at the Perez with Franklin, and just recently moved back to Los Angeles. I'm from California, for this opportunity to kind of work a little bit more independently, and this biennial is a really great kind of way to start thinking about, as Naima said, putting in focus a lot of the things we've been working towards in our careers for the last 10 years, which is to say kind of pulling together threads from different geographies and different communities that we've been working with through the lens of New Orleans. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity and really kind of profound challenge to, as you indicated, to be from the outside kind of looking in and trying to make meaning in a new city.
And so that's a great transition question. I've actually had a conversation with Naima, particularly. I'm from New Orleans, actually, originally, so that's my home base, that is my heart. I currently live in New York. I work at the Laundromat Project. We work at the Laundromat Project around community building, connecting with communities. And so I'm particularly interested, as both of you being Los Angeles natives and thinking about cities like Los Angeles or New York or maybe even Miami that has a little bit more of a diversity in culture, just meaning a lot of different cultures kind of situated coming from the outside, coming into the city itself. New Orleans being a very kind of grounded place in the sense that if you're from New Orleans, you're from New Orleans, and not many people come from outside of New Orleans to come to New Orleans, and it's very deep. So then how do you bring kind of your understanding of community into a place that has a community that's so tight-knit and so bounded?
Yeah, we were joking because every everyone we met, every Uber driver or Lyft driver or cab driver would always say born and raised, born and raised. That is like the New Orleans kind of motto, because I think it's a city that has so much pride and so much sense of community and self. I think it's very much what you identify this question of like, if you are from New Orleans, you are deeply from New Orleans. And even if you've lived there your whole life, you are not from New Orleans. Like, and I think that is really important and something really interesting. I think that we're trying to be really attuned to, like, why are people so strongly connected to that place? Because I think that is really unique about New Orleans in this kind of way that, I mean, Miami, I think, has a similar sense of pride in a similar kind of way that, like, you're really deeply from here. And I think, as you kind of indicate, it's because it's the particular mix of cultures that you only find there. There is no like city like New Orleans in the United States. And I think that is what makes it very complicated to engage with, but also just incredibly, I mean, it's such a culturally rich city in every level, architecturally, culinarily, musically, obviously, performance, all of these things. So I think as a kind of space for us to respond to, I think it feels really rich.
I think, just to piggyback and to echo what Diana was saying, you know, I think we've also tried to approach it with the understanding that we're not from New Orleans, right? So we're not going to try and pretend like we are. We're not going to but try and say, oh, over 3 years we're going to now become New Orleanians. And I think that kind of respect, I think people have appreciated. But at the same time, I think that we're going every 3 months. We're going every quarter for at least 4 and 5 days. We are staying in a different part of New Orleans every time we go. So we're actually not staying in hotels. We're actually staying in different neighborhoods. We are trying many different kinds of restaurants. Obviously, enjoying beignets and Southern cuisine, but also just enjoying the diversity of the city. Because I think people just don't realize there also is a huge Vietnamese community. There, after the storm, there were a lot of people come from different parts of the country or different parts of the world to kind of help rebuild the city. And so I think that we're very much interested in learning how, or kind of respecting the historical nature of the city, but also trying to explore as many of the neighborhoods as possible to really understand the city in a different way. So.
And I think also, just to add to that, is that I think we are not ever going to, you can never become an expert on a city that is as diverse and complicated as that city, but I think there are so many amazing people doing the work there, artists, cultural producers, curators, musicians. So I think we really want to build, Prospect in this edition as a platform to include and amplify the voices that are already on the ground doing that work in a really deep way.
That's what we've heard over and over again. We very much, our first 2 trips were about listening and about understanding the organization and the organization's history in the city. And because now we're at P5 and it's been, a decade since the first one, the city has gotten, the arts community has obviously very familiar with what to expect of Prospect. And they've definitely told us that they want to be a part of the organization, right? They want to be visible. They want us to amplify what's already happening, that there's a thriving arts community there. And so this idea of just kind of like bringing in things from the outside is great. And I think it definitely kind of is going to allow for a certain conversation. But it also, again, I think it's challenged us to really think about how we can amplify the amazing things that are already happening.
Thank you. And then in thinking about putting together a biennial, which feels like such a big thing, right?
Yes.
So you're working for, 2.5 years now before the biennial opens officially. Where do you even start? Like, what is the conversation situated? What does that look like? How do you even wrap your head around a biennial?
Do you want to start?
So, as Diana said, because we've known each other for a number of years, I think that's really been great in that we're not necessarily getting to know each other. And that, hi, my name is Naima, and I'm a tourist. And, so it's great that we kind of skip through all of that. But I think it really did start with thinking about a longer artist list. And so first, it's kind of like, okay, every single artist that we've ever been interested in, and that kind of thinking, okay, who are we thinking about? What are we thinking about? It also started with visits to the city. Right after it was announced, a month later, we were in the city for a week. And so then it started with kind of getting to know New Orleans. It started with, like I said, meeting as many of the past Prospect artists as possible, going to as many of the previous sites as we could, and really doing a deep dive, I think, into the history of both the organization, but then also its relationship to different arts initiatives that have happened there. And so now it's also, when we're there, it's also about seeing the new sites. because Prospect is just as much about being in the museum space as it is about being in the city. And so it's really, I think, amazing about this triennial versus other ones where you really do have an opportunity to work with an artist and put them in a very unconventional space that allows you as the viewer to see their work in a very different context, right? So, you're thinking, okay, Mark Bradford's work in the church or so, whatever the combination is, but the idea that hopefully it kind of brings to light maybe a different aspect of the artist's practice that maybe hadn't been considered. So for us, it's thinking about artists, but simultaneously thinking about the site, because oftentimes the site is maybe not equipped to handle artwork, right, in a very neat way. And so it's also thinking about, okay, how can we prepare the site, or how can we seriously consider putting an art project in the site, and we need the lead time to do that. So it's a little bit of all those things together.
Yeah, and I think in addition to this artist list, it was very much trying to think about New Orleans as a site. So I think our initial kind of thoughts was to kind of compare what artists are on our minds, what artists feel really relevant for this moment, what artists have we always wanted to work with, what artists have we already worked with, but also very much kind of thinking about bouncing off the city itself. Who can, in a really great way, engage that city? And so the people that we've kind of thought about early on are people that we've really thought had a kind of relationship or a correspondence to the city, whether via their own biography, their family's history, whether something they've already done, whether research they're working on. I think so that was a real that's really a pivot point for us. We want this biennial to feel very grounded in that city, and I think there's all different models for biennials, and everyone has a different mandate, but I think, as Naima indicated, this is a really unique one because it forces you out into the city. So for a lot of people, this might be their first trip to New Orleans, so it's important for us to kind of shine a light on the city itself. And you also can't compete with the city. Like, no painting will ever be as good as like a New Orleans, like sunset on a porch or whatever. It's like such a beautiful place that I think those questions of how that dynamism can be kind of reflected and responded to by artists has just been a really important question for us.
And then as you're working through and preparing for the biennial, you also have jobs, like day jobs. So I'm particularly curious in how you navigate between the two roles, and if there's ever any crossover or intersection between the two. Are the practices totally separate and distinct from one another, or is there some bleed every once in a while?
I think as curators, you're sort of always working and thinking and doing, and so I think we have different, Naima is officially at an institution and running a whole program, and I work on exhibitions independently, and so I do studio visits every week, and I'm all over the country for various reasons, like in Portland and Minneapolis and Houston and Atlanta doing visits. And then, we come back and bring those artists to the table, both for our own independent work, but then collectively and say, I just met someone, I'm working on this other project with them, but they would be perfect for. So I think it all feeds into this larger conversation. And it's actually, I think, been really productive because, I joke, I've been preparing for this moment my whole life. But I think in a lot of ways, I'm looking back in my mind, I met that artist in 2008 who didn't make any sense for what I was doing then, but now, they feel like they could be just right for this. So I think it's that kind of, your practice is always kind of feeding into itself through that process.
Yeah, I think, Prospect is unique in that way, in that I obviously can't speak to every single biennial and triennial, but it is one of the few that you still do have your full-time job outside of organizing this very large exhibition. I think, just to be completely honest, I think part of that is funding. They're just, Prospect is a very, nimble and, small organization, and so they just don't have the resources to really fund us, primarily working on this. But also, I do think it's interesting how they feed off of one another and that kind of thing. I think for me, because the mission of the California African American Museum is so specific, that actually Prospect allows me to work with artists that I would not be able to work with otherwise, just because it doesn't fit within my mission. So I also feel like I've been, given an enormous gift by having the ability to work on this project, because they're, artists that are Caucasian, that I like, shocker, and that, they would not have an opportunity, because our mission, because the institutions I've worked for, in terms of Studio Museum and now CAM, the mission is very specific. So I think being able to just, really kind of engage with artists that I hadn't necessarily thought about, or artists that are, like I said, out of my geographical purview, I think has been the most exciting. But it is tough, and it is a juggling act, and we definitely have to, Diana and I talk pretty much I think 2 or 3 times a day, which is probably well beyond maybe what we should, not say we should be, but, I think we fully recognize the enormity of the project and that the fact that it's coming up in 2020 and that we need to prepare. And it is a juggling act, but I think one does inform the other. Also just because we're on juries and we're all, so they all, as Diana said, everything kind of informs everything else.
I'm trying to figure out which question to ask. I have two that I want, but I'm trying to distinguish. Yes. I know, right? I have so many questions. Mike's answering everything right now for me. What is the process like when you are working with an artist in helping, I guess, kind of shape their vision of what the project is that they're realizing through the biennial itself? How much do you interject into the process? How much do you step back and allow them to shape what it is? Can you talk a little bit about that?
TBD, I think. I think we're really in the stage right now where we're starting to talk to specific artists about just to invite them in. And I think that process will begin with a site visit to New Orleans. So we're preparing a bibliography and a filmography and just some information on the city to give them ahead of time. But we're really hopeful that we can bring everybody in for about a week to kind of do very regular tourist things and also to do deep dives into specific archives in the city and see really special sites and kind of think about that as a jumping off point for them. I think we have asked specific artists because, okay, we love this aspect of your practice, but I think we're really open to where the process leads them. And I think we want this to be an opportunity for them to do something that pushes them a little bit. And I think different artists require different kind of relationships and want different conversations. We told people, you can call us every day, it's fine. And there's other people that it's like, we will see you in 6 months and you'll hand us a blueprint or something. So I think it's very much trying to keep in communication and keep a real interface around, just making sure that we're developing in sync. And I think also these initial artists are people that will help shape our thinking around the biennial. So it's a very much a mutual kind of conversation.
I totally agree. I think that we often try and follow the artist's lead in terms of the amount of intervention that they want, right? So, just to echo what Diana was saying, if an artist wants a lot of hands-on, not say assistance, but guidance, we're happy to do that. A number of artists have never worked in New Orleans. A number of artists have never had an opportunity really to spend a lot of time there. So we recognize that the bibliography, that the list, spending at least a week in the city at minimum, I think will allow them to kind of build out that context. But also I think that, if we have the ability to help shape a project, not necessarily force anything, of course, down anyone's throat, but if they're curious about knowing or wanting our input, we're happy to give it. But we do see it as a collaborative process. And just in every curator, every show is a collaboration. And so there are very few times that that one of us is not involved in some instrumental way to kind of help shape a project. And sometimes it could just be logistical, right? So if we're showing in an abandoned church or whatever, we have to work closely together to know where the outlets are, the heating, all those kind of logistical things. Or it leaks, or whatever the case may be. But it often starts with, like I said, the conversation, and then it's going to go into a site visit, and then it's going to really start kind of sitting down talking about a project. How is that in line with what we're thinking about for the triennial overall? And then we kind of, keep the conversation going until it materializes into the final project.
And then I asked this question because it's something that's been pointed in the introduction of the two of you as the curators for the biennial. What does it mean to be kind of the first women who are helping shape this story?
It's not lost on us, I think, how big of a deal it is. I think that we say it with pride because, on one level people are like, it's about time, but I think we're excited, of course, but I also think that, I don't know, I don't necessarily, of course we think we're going to make the best one, right? Of course, which is a little biased. I think that people are really responding to that. Like when we meet people in the city or just kind of we're out in the world and we're the team that's doing the next prospect, I think that they're very open, they're cheering us on, they want us to succeed. I think any artistic director, they want that to happen. But I think it's not lost on New Orleans, especially, the significance of this moment. And so I think we're taking all of that love and embrace and letting us kind of propel us forward. I think, like the Whitney, biennial is being curated by 2 women right now. New Museum is currently being curated by 2 women. So I think there's definitely a takeover right now, which is amazing. And I think we're we're happy to be a part of the conversation.
Also, the other kind of thing is that it's 2 people. And so it's already a dialogic model. It's already we're in conversation. And I think that kind of idea of kind of creating a biennial that's modeled on that, on listening and responding and listening and responding, instead of a kind of top-down model, which I think is a kind of feminist model and a matriarchal model in some ways. And I think it's also comes out of what it means to already be in collaboration. So I think that word is so critical to this process for us as like a kind of almost like a value statement that we would ascribe to how this biennial happens. Because I think for most people, they'll just see what they see when they are in the city. But I think for the artists and for us and for a lot of people in the arts community and other cultural communities in New Orleans, the process will be incredibly important. And we're trying to be very transparent about that because I think we want to bring people along. It's not meant to be like the kind of circus comes to town, but it's like that they've had a chance to get to know us and artists, and if an artist wants to do something responding to that city, to ensure that they're really literally in conversation with people about it, that it's never a monologue. I think that is really important.
I would say that but it does come up, right? Because people ask us, how are you going to work together? I don't know if they're asking us because we're 2 women, or they're asking us because we're 2 people, or I don't know. We're always kind of questioning that, because are they questioning it because they're wondering, okay, how can 2 women work together? So I'm always kind of like take a pause at that question, but but mainly I think it's coming from this idea that, like, how are decisions going to be made? Like, so if she's really gunning for an artist that I don't necessarily like, then how are we going to really come to? And we honestly have not had a single argument. I think because we both respect each other's vision and understand that that even if I'm, she's like really, really excited about an artist, because I trust her curatorial judgment, that I will do the research to kind of get there, and I think vice versa, where I'm kind of like, okay, because she's like, I really could see this being there, and I think it's about trust, and I think in each other's process. But it's interesting how people are really kind of curious, I think, about as if we're going to have some like cat fight in the back, what I'm saying, pulling each other's hair out, where it's like, I was like, it's not that serious, like really. But plus there are, the average prospect has 50 artists in the exhibition. So if there's an artist that she's like die hard about, that I'm like, what, I think is really interesting, I would love to see how this materializes, I'm of course going to support her in that endeavor, because it's not like there's 50 artists, but it's interesting how often it comes up that people are so surprised that that there's 2 of us. I think there's just the idea around there needing to be a singular artistic voice. And I'm kind of like, to me, as Diana said, again, that the nature of being a curator is inherently collaborative. And so we're already used to doing that every single day. And so it doesn't change when you're working on it for a larger exhibition. But also I think it's worked because, like I said, she spent 5 years in Miami, I was 5 years in New York, she was in New York before that. I mean, we have such different life experiences. She can get on a plane every week, I can't, because I have 2 kids. But I think that it allows us to see and explore different things, and also come to the table with very different perspectives. I think could add. She has a much more of a Latin American, interest and focus. Obviously, I'm, very diehard West Coast, African American. So, I think that I think melded together, I think it makes for. I know it's going to make for a much richer show.
How are we doing on time? I actually don't have no one. Oh, sorry.
We have 20 minutes.
Okay, cool. So you keep asking.
And I think I also think just because we came up, we have similar formative experiences at institutions. We both worked at LAX Art really early. We both kind of have been, came up in the same art world in a way, and have a lot of similar mentors or similar people we respect, or artists. So I think for us that's also, we have very different expertise and perspectives, but I think we have a shared ethos that is around, relevant social questions and inclusivity, and thinking very much about audience and very much about place. So I think there's a kind of shared foundational kind of intellectual or ethical position, even if there are many different artists that we're kind of tapped into and thinking about, because I think they all kind of come into that mix from this idea of how do you create an ethical biennial, and how do you kind of create something that is really open for audiences of all kinds.
And then I will leave space for questions for Naima and Diana. As you're thinking about creating this space where many people will have many voices, sharing many stories over a short period of time. What does community mean to you individually and in your practice as well? What does it mean, both community of affinity, community of place, how they merge and meld with one another?
I just want to give a shout out to Ayesha right now. Yeah. She literally jumped in 5 minutes ago.
Yeah,
and
this
the fact
is
that she's hitting us
improv.
with all
Yes.
that great. And I know that she's from New Orleans, because I didn't obviously, but she literally was like, "Do you need me to do?" I was like, "Yes, girl," because Gia is stuck in traffic. Thank you.
Yeah,
the questions are amazing. Just
truly.
be called on 5 minutes ago, so I just want to give a shout out to my girl. But in terms of community, in terms of what it means in the context of
I think what it means is
this.
her first, so kind of introducing that, and then also within the context how you might bring that into the work.
Sure. I mean, I think I learned a lot about that idea of community in Miami. I think community gets bandied about euphemistically all the time, very problematically by arts institutions that want to reach the community. And it's like, who are we actually talking about? But I think being in Miami, it was so instructive to be part of a team that built this institution. And, we had a really strong curatorial department, but we also had a really strong education department, and who really defined what community meant in terms of thinking about what languages are we using? Like, are we being bilingual in a city that needs bilingualism? How are we dealing with different ably people? How are we giving tours in that way? Like, those kinds of questions, you build a project around that. And how are you reflecting who you'd like to see in your audience in your museum? So do people feel represented? Do they feel that the conversations that are relevant to them feel kind of like they're urgent for us as well in the arts and culture that we're producing? So I think some of those questions that you build an institution that should reflect your however you conceptualize community, what it should mean. And so I think very much for us, thinking about the biennial, when we think about who we want to come, what conversations we want to be part of, that's how we've been thinking about our artists, who are also their own community that will kind of build. I mean, we've been talking about family, because I think that is sort of, you build these kind of nucleus families, and then you kind of extend out from there. But I think New Orleans is such a community-based place. It's incredible. Like, I've never been somewhere where they're like, I am from this neighborhood, and I was like, okay, I have to learn the neighborhoods, I have to learn the wards, it's very specific. And so I think that is a really important issue and something to be really sensitive and thoughtful about there.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm always just saying ditto to what my partner in crime is saying. But I think in the context of Prospect, I think first and foremost, I think we want to honor the residents of the city. I think that Prospect was born out of wanting to shine a light and bring attention to the arts community post Katrina. So I think we're first and foremost thinking about how we can mount an exhibition that is both out, like as Diana was saying, out in the city and accessible to as many people as possible. We're also thinking about the art community, because of course we want people to come in to New Orleans to experience both the exhibition itself, but then all of the different aspects of Prospect. One of the ways that Prospect has tried to kind of engage its larger community is through a satellite program. And so there's the exhibition itself, which often is between 50 and 73 artists, and then it's housed in different artwork is housed at different sites throughout the city. There's also a satellite program in which galleries or even art spaces are allowed to apply to then mount exhibitions to kind of coincide with Prospect. There's a pretty democratic process. You literally apply. Oftentimes you get approved, and then it's listed in a longer book. So there's like Prospect and all of its sites, as well as all the kind of the satellite locations, and that allows for visitors who are coming in to know what's happening in other parts of the city, but then again for other communities or other arts organizations to also receive visibility when they have 100,000 visitors coming in during the run of Prospect. So I think that for Prospect, we're very much kind of thinking about all these different overlapping communities as well.
And then I think one last question, and then I'll open it up for Q&A for folks in the audience. But when you think about art, what is so powerful about art, or why does art matter? When you kind of open up a space, or the biennial kind of in New Orleans, what do you hope to see it do within the city, or how do you hope people will connect to what you're doing?
That's a
couple of questions in
no,
one.
no.
I'm sorry.
I think what we ultimately hope is that that people see their city in a different way. I think that we hope that art has the power in general, but particularly with Prospect, to spark conversation about not only just the history of the city, but the context of which it's being shown in, and how that conversation, I think, will hopefully lead to larger change, right? So if, for example, there was an artist, why am I blanking on his name, who did the project about lead in the water. Mel. So there was a project in the first project, for the first Prospect, his name was Mel Chin, and he did an entire project about how much lead was in the soil after Katrina, or it was already there, but it was really kind of unearthed, if you will, after Katrina. And the kids in the neighborhood all got involved. They basically painted paper money to then they were going to take to the steps of the Capitol. In DC as a way to bring attention to basically the very harmful toxins that are in the soil in New Orleans. And I think that project was amazing for a number of reasons. It really built community, but also, again, raised huge awareness to, again, the toxic materials that are in our soil and our land every day. And so I think what art had the power of doing is bringing people's focus to this very alarming issue, right? And so what we hope is that, obviously not every project can kind of raise that kind of awareness, but what we do hope is that people bring maybe a different level of attention to the issue that's being raised by the artist, and that hopefully that builds a community around that topic as well, right? So there's so many projects throughout Prospect that have brought a level of attention to either very serious issues or just, again, was, I think, food for thought, or really brought attention to maybe an underknown aspect of New Orleans history or just U.S. history that I think has really been long-lasting. So we're, like I said, we're hoping that art has the power to, the change, I think, is what ultimately do. But again, I think sparking conversation is what we're really ultimately hoping for.
Yeah, and I think we're both people who have essentially dedicated our lives to art, and I think we're believers. In some ways, I still, at the end of the day, really believe that people can have a transformative experience with a work of art that will really change them or move them, even in that brief moment or over a longer period of time. And I think that's something that I still really think that is the kind of, operates on a spiritual or intellectual level in that way. I think art really can be quite transcendent. And so I think that is something that we hope to be able to offer. And that is so different for different people, but I think to kind of really still understand that there's something very human about having these kind of moments with a work of art or with an installation or a kind of experience, and to kind of really think about that as well, to kind of really think about how an individual might be impacted, both in this kind of social consequence that Naima talks about, that I think we are both really sits at the core of our practice, but also I think that kind of much more personal experience.
So yes, we would love to open it up for questions. We have a wireless mic. I think we're all just we're just doing it.
Shout or
we're just winging this, but no pressure. We can just keep chatting if no one.
Do you want the mic?
or can you
Shout it out. Okay, Ayesha is moderator and she's a curator in New York. Hi.
So this is kind of a loaded question, and you may have answered it already, but what do you think your role is in the art world? What is your role? How do you define it?
What? Oh.
So
My title, right, is Deputy Director and Chief Curator, which means that I oversee the exhibitions, education, and marketing departments at the California African American Museum. So my role is predominantly to shape the exhibition program and the way in which people interpret the exhibitions. Although I oversee 9 staff members and a number, so there are definitely people who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but in terms of, it's my job to kind of oversee that. But in the larger art world, honestly, I see my role as bringing visibility to the artists that I think are doing amazing, that are doing amazing work out in the world. For me, like I said, I've I have, because I'm born and raised in LA and I'm from California, and I've had an opportunity just to realize that how, and I was saying this a little bit earlier, but how underknown the histories of African American artists are in Southern California. I pretty much kind of made that one of my passions. I don't exclusively just work with LA artists, but again, there's so many artists that are on the West Coast that I think are just underknown. But I also have a passion for Atlanta because I went to Spelman. You know, I have a passion. But ultimately, I think what I try and do through both my curatorial projects, Instagram, Facebook, but just also word of mouth, and what I tell other people is advocacy. That's what I see. You know, and I people often like joke with me about, because I have like 10 jobs, and so and it's not because I want 10 jobs. It's just because I take my role as an advocate so seriously that if I have a seat at the table, that I could advocate for you in a real way. That's the honest to God truth, right? So I can, because Prospect allows me to advocate for artists in New Orleans or in the South or in other areas that I can't do in my job at the California African American Museum. Me working with, you know, Expo Chicago next year allows me to work with galleries, you know, in different parts of the country that may not have the resources to get to art fairs. So I can advocate in that arena. We both often serve on juries and panels because you can advocate for artists in so many different ways. And so I think ultimately our job as curators is to be both an advocate in the museum space, but then also just out in the world.
Yes. Okay. All of that. Yeah. I also would add that I think, which I think Naima has an incredibly pivotal role to play in the contemporary scene. But I think both of us think a lot about how institutions serve publics and how we shape the kind of structures that have, you know, historically operated in certain ways. And I think there's a lot of change afoot right now. And I think we are part of a generation of curators that will expand not only the way the institution works, but the way the art histories that they narrate, and to kind of think about expanding that canon. I mean, Naima and I both come out of art history. That's what our degrees are in. And I think while we work in the absolute most contemporary sense of now, I think it's very much with an eye towards opening up that field and towards thinking about how institutions can better do that and continue to kind of expand and blow up the kind of canon that has been so narrow for so long. So I think a lot of that is thinking what we can do now for actual artists, but what we're also doing longer term to kind of develop strategies and lay foundations that will continue to serve generation after generation. So, and I think that's the work of an institution, right? That we just serve an institution. It was there before us, it will be there after us. So how can we help shepherd it to be better and to do better? So I think that's a lot of kind of when I talk about our shared ethos, I think that's something we both really share and think about a lot.
Hello.
One person behind
I just
you.
say kudos, congratulations to everything that y'all are doing. I really admire that. So my question is for you guys, since you like worked all over the country and you bringing in all these different artists, how important is it that you bring artists that are actually from New Orleans? Are they top priority first to be like the originators?
Yeah, I think New Orleans is a top priority in terms of thinking about what is happening on the ground there in terms of literal artists making work, but also what are the concerns of the artistic community of that city. So what is at the fore of their mind, I think, has been part of this listening exercise has been really important. And I also think in terms of New Orleans, because it's a city that is culturally producing across a lot of fields, we're not being hard and fast about capital A artists, that we're also thinking about cultural producers who work in other capacities, people who work with food, people who are writers, people who are anthropologists, people who do walking tours, people who publish books, people who have radio stations, kind of all the critical ways that we produce and shape culture, I think is something that New Orleans is particularly expansive in their thinking around that. So we're trying to be very attuned to that.
But I will say that, you know, while 100%, you know, New Orleans is the top priority, Prospect, it was thought of as a biennial, right, originally, and now it's a triennial, but it was thought of as this idea of bringing artists from the outside into the city. So while, again, I think New Orleans artists are definitely a priority, we also, you know, have to honor the, you know, kind of mission of the organization in that it is about, you know, bringing artists in to respond to the city and to also make, you know, to produce dynamic projects. So, I think that is a question we get often, and I think that there's always kind of this numbers game of like how many of this and how many of that. It's usually been about 10% of the artist list have been from New Orleans. It doesn't necessarily mean that's a magic number by any means, but we're also very aware of the structure of the organization in that, also the structure, but just the kind of founding of Prospect, where it really is about bringing artists in as well, and because it is a typical biennial in that way.
And I think, yeah.
You already answered a little bit when you were answering the other lady's question and the lady in the back. But I was just curious about your choices, how the cultural impact of the city, because they had such a rich culture in New Orleans, how that's impacting how you envision this biannual. Are you looking at certain things? I remember when I was in New Orleans, you had kids tap dancing on the street, for example. You had art, music practically everywhere. So I'm curious, what things are you hitting in your mind where you want to focus on in terms of installations, in terms of how you're going to bring that culture in that makes New Orleans different, let's say, than the Venice Biannual?
I mean, honestly, I don't know if we're there yet in terms of like, this is where we're focusing. I think right now we're still very much learning the city. We've been together. We've now been twice. Like I said, we went in June, and then we were just there in October. We're going back in January. We're going again in March. Because of course we have to experience Mardi Gras. So, I think that like before we kind of make too many assumptions about what we're going to focus on after having been somewhere twice, I think we want to experience the city as much as we can and talk to as many people as we can, and just being open-minded to the process. So I think that while we're of course noticing things, and as Diana kind of mentioned a couple times, the dynamic history of the city, the fact that there's so many different neighborhoods with a very rich history that we're mining all the time, and that people are sharing stories about their own childhood and their own, like Ayesha and I had a long conversation about being from New Orleans. So I think right now we're just about kind of soaking it all in. And then when people give us recommendations, we're taking them up on that. And, they say, oh, meet this person, you got to meet this person. We're doing it. And we're trying to fit as much as we can in when we go on our visit. So I don't know if we're at the focus stage. I mean, we need to get there pretty soon because the triennial is opening in 2020. But we also don't necessarily want to make assumptions, right, about a city that we've only been to twice. So I think we're trying to be open to learning as much as we can. And we know when we start bringing artists out, they're also going to show us and want to learn more about different things as well. That's going to open up, I think, our mode of thinking as well. So I think we're very much, I think, still in exploratory research phase.
And I think that's time, unless there's any other questions.
Again, thank you so much, Ayesha,
Thank
for
y'all
jumping
for
in. Like
the
I said,
conversation.
maybe Gia will join another panel. Gia Hamilton is an amazing, dynamic curator. She also has an exhibition, an Afrofuturist exhibition that's up in the city right now. I think it's called, I'll have to find out the details, but we will definitely share these at a later time. But again, thank you to Ayesha. Mark your calendars, October 2020. I think it's October 15th or something, October 2020. But please join us in the city. And if you have any questions, we'll be hanging out. She has to skedaddle, but I'll be around. So let us know.